I'm Mike Fargo. I'm a faculty member in the Behavioral Sciences Department at Grand Rapids Community College. And with me is Terry Jentz, who is an activist and author of a very well-received book published in 2006 called Strange Piece of Paradise. And in this book, Terry recounts an episode in her life in 1977 when she and her roommate on a cross-country bike trip were attacked and nearly killed by an anonymous assailant. And that was a crime that was never solved. In 1995, Terry initiated an effort to investigate and to try and solve that terrible crime, and in doing so, wrote a book that recounts her ordeal and the efforts that she took to try and investigate that more fully. And I'd like to welcome you this morning.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Right. You presented last night to the community at Fountain Street Church. What'd you think of that venue?
Well, first of all, as I told the group, it was a fulfillment of a lifelong fantasy to be a preacher, thundering from the pulpit. And actually, I initially asked to use the pulpit, and Chris Arnold told me, well, you can if you want, but you better take a look at what it's like. Then when I got there, I realized that was maybe a bit too high and mighty.
Well, it's a pretty powerful post, isn't it?
It's a pretty powerful post. But I did go up there beforehand and checked it out, and I saw that the preacher had a little box of Altoids,
yeah,
and some Kleenex, so that brought him down,
kind of relaxes.
Her down to
worried about his breath and
to human scale.
Good, good. Well, I thought that it was particularly poignant, given the essence of your message there, which is an evaluation or an investigation of our commitment to our own humanity to a certain respect.
That's well said. Yeah.
What do you see your primary message as being?
Oh, well, primary message, I suppose if I had to boil it down, it would be that we all need to have the courage to stand up to our abusers, to whatever evil we see,
right,
whatever injustice we see in the world.
Right.
We have a responsibility to take action on behalf of ourselves and on behalf of others.
I think some of the comments that came out of the audience afterward were the most telling with respect to that.
Well, tell me who you think, for example.
The woman that came down at the end and talked about her concern that there was some emphasis being given on why women don't leave abusive homes, for example. I thought that really oriented the conversation in a very constructive way, because the dynamics of victimology, of learned helplessness, of what happens when you're exposed to repeated assaults on your person, on your both physical and emotional well-being, how that wears you down and convinces you that you don't have any other options, and maybe possibly don't deserve any other options, unfortunately.
She was a particularly poignant figure. That woman, I learned quite a bit about her afterwards, because she came up to me when I was signing books. She had seen me on the local news station.
Oh, really?
And had rushed down to be in that audience. And afterwards, there was another woman who had also been abused, mm-hmm, and was being still abused. Mm-hmm. Actually, the one that you're referring to, I think, had gotten out of that, mm-hmm, abusive relationship, but this other one was still in it. And they met each other at my signing table.
Oh, really?
And they walked out together, and the one was going to help the other. And that was pretty incredible. That was extraordinarily gratifying for me to see.
Well, I think one of the other truths about this topic is that statistically many women in that audience had been exposed to abuse. The statistics on sexual assault, for example, are quite chilling, in that 1 out of 7 women at some time in their lives will be exposed to sexual violence.
And 1 out of 3 will be abused.
Right.
Worldwide, and that figure adheres to America as well. Right. 1 out of 3. And by the way, it's interesting. A year ago, exactly a year ago, I was in Oslo, Norway, promoting my book in the Norwegian version, and of all places, Scandinavia is supposed to be part of the world where
Right.
the genders are equal.
Right.
Well, what's so fascinating is that actually 1 out of 3 women are abused in Scandinavia
Really?
as well.
Really?
And that domestic violence is as prevalent as anywhere in the world, but they don't speak of it because, of course, officially they're supposed to be, the genders are supposed to be equal. So there's almost a taboo against really admitting to it.
Right.
And it was fascinating because I was told again and again and again, oh, you know, we're equal, genders are equal, Oslo's completely safe, women can walk anywhere they want.
Mm-hmm.
So here I was, an activist on behalf of issues of violence against women in town for just 4 days. And on the last day, I was walking in downtown Oslo and was surrounded by a group of boys who sexually harassed me.
Oh my gosh.
And I was in a state of outrage about that because in a place where they claimed that it didn't happen, there
Right.
it happened to me. And what was the statistic probability of that? I've lived in Los Angeles since 1990, and it's never happened to me there.
Right.
So how could I spend 4 days in downtown Oslo in the tourist area and be harassed, and how could that not be just as prevalent as anywhere else?
Right.
The truth is, it's a global pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
climate violence against women. We have to face up to it, but we too often push it to the margins of our consciousness.
Well, I think there is an acceptability of it that that sometimes gets portrayed in really unsavory ways, like blaming victims for
Yeah.
being in the wrong place or doing the wrong thing or wearing the wrong thing, when in fact the spotlight of truth and justice needs to burn in on the aggressor,
Which was the point of that woman, but it was the point of my talk as well.
Right.
But getting back to that woman, do you think that she was feeling that the group and the conversation had been focusing too much on why don't the women leave?
I think that
Because I don't think we did actually.
No, well, I think that there's an emphasis on trying to make sense of circumstance and random acts of violence that go unchecked is unreasonable. It's psychotic. Why would you allow yourself to be to stay in a situation like that? And so people try and justify the fact that even exists by saying things like, well, she could just have left.
Yes.
Right? She could have left at any time that she wanted.
Well,
not understanding the dynamics that we see over and over again in patterns where people, not just women,
Yeah.
men, children as well, both stay and even identify with the people who are abusing them.
Right. That is sort of in the current dialogue, I think. But I was wondering whether you thought that she was resentful of the group itself.
I think
last
she
night.
was. I think that not resentful, but I think that what she was wanting to do was to draw our attention back to the fact that we really need to hold the abuser accountable.
Yes.
This isn't about assertiveness, for example. This isn't about a woman's responsibility to vacate a situation where she's being assaulted. This is about holding the person who's doing the assaulting responsible for that and making that less acceptable within
Yes.
the context of our society. I thought that you had a really interesting point at the end where you commented that you would really turn the tables on what often happens, that you rode in from out of town, and rather than being shown the door, you essentially bonded with the people in that community and the unfortunate soul that had done this. You're fairly confident that he has done this, or that
100% confident.
Right. He has been relatively excommunicated from his own community there, which I thought was a move in the right direction, holding him accountable.
Yeah, but your comment about his being an unfortunate soul, he brought all the misfortune on himself.
No,
and we have to be clear about that.
Yes, what I meant was him as an unfortunate within the context of humanity. He's a terrible example of what we can be as human beings.
That's right.
as a psychologist, one of the lenses that I look at things through is the science of psychopathology, and we would relatively easily classify him by your description as being an unsocialized sociopath, somebody with
Yes.
a very well-defined antisocial personality disorder. There's debate in the literature about whether people like that are born, that this is a consequence of genetics, or whether this is a consequence of socialization, of upbringing, of you mentioned permissiveness in the family. You had done some research on this man's background. Did you have a thought about that?
Well, I do believe that in his case, he was adopted. Mm-hmm. He probably had some genetic predisposition to sociopathic tendencies. Mm-hmm. I think then his environment kicked in, and it was a toxic combination of parents who were, I think, frightened of their child from the time he was very little. Apparently, I'd heard from neighbors that he would growl at other little children. Mm-hmm. He was the type of child, as I pointed out in my book, that he would do the opposite thing that he was told. I mean, he would. A neighbor had a pea garden, and she said, "Please don't step on the growing peas, because I would like to grow a garden. I'd like them to grow so we can eat them." And when she turned her back, he'd gone and he'd plucked up every single growing plant for her entire garden, at the age of 3. Now, where does this behavior come from? The parents were not wanting him to throw tantrums, so they were allowing him to get his way, mm-hmm. to smooth things over in the family. But then what started to happen is that then they drew no boundaries whatsoever, and he started to get away with more and more. And he became the little tyrant in his own family. And as he got older, the situation got more permissive, mm-hmm. and he was never held accountable for any of his misdeeds. Now, and I didn't find any report from anywhere that he had ever been abused in his family.
Right.
If anything, he was the tyrant abusing right. certainly his sibling. I did hear a lot of tales about how he had actually, killed her cat, right. beat her up, etc.
That's kind of a classic trajectory that the empirical literature talks about, going from what's considered to be just oppositional to having unsocialized conduct problems to having a full-blown manifestation of antisocial personality disorder. So he's probably a textbook case. But you're essentially arguing nature and nurture in this respect, right?
And I'm no expert on psychopaths. However, I've read a few books about them, and there are more and more, mm-hmm. and they seem to cohere around the idea that it's a combination
yep.
of nature and nurture. And I have read that in societies that emphasize community over the individual, mm-hmm. that although psychopathic tendencies would be the same in the genes, right. That there isn't that element of hyper individuality right. in those cultures that would allow somebody like my attacker to sort of have everything he wants, because right. that's of course our culture is we get everything we want.
That's very well stated, and you're right. That emphasis on community. And your place within the community tends to suppress some of those. And here, where we glorify the individual, right, and the right to express in almost any way that we choose within the bounds of the law, or obviously in his case outside of the bounds of the law, that's actually celebrated to a certain degree.
As a friend of mine says, America is a garden paradise for growing psychopaths.
Yeah, I think that there's probably some truth to that. When I was looking at your book, it struck me that your life had really been divided into several different stages. Through your teens and young adulthood and your early college years, and then this tragic event occurring, and then it seemed like the next 15 years you existed until you decided to investigate this and to write your own book. And I wonder what was going on in your life in that intervening 15 years. Well,
that's an interesting question, because when this attack first happened, I had survived the attack, which seemed like a kind of heroic place mm-hmm. to be. I had survived the unsurvivable. Mm-hmm. And so my idea was that I was some kind of specially anointed person. That self-concept started to break down with the passage of years, when actually I realized that I was a haunted person, quite haunted by nightmares, by repetitive dreams, by increasing fears, with what seemed like a paralysis of will, a dispersal of my previous energies, my lack of concentration. I didn't feel like, if I could have extrapolated from the girl I was before that attack into the future, I didn't feel like I was that person.
Right.
There was a broken line.
Right.
I wasn't the same person, and I had to look back at this attack finally and say, wait a minute, I think this experience fundamentally changed me. And so it was then that I had this, in my mid-30s, made this instinctual choice to go back into the past, because I felt like that I needed to, in order to move into the future, I needed to go back. And so I went back to piece together the story of what happened to myself on June 22nd, 1977. I had always been a writer, a professional writer. I had been trying to write other people's stories, and I never was able to reach the depth that I wanted to reach. And I finally woke up to the fact that it was because I wasn't looking at my own deepest psyche, that I wasn't able to skim beneath the surface of anything until I could face my own deepest self, my own deepest fears, my own history. And so, interestingly enough, by going back to look at what happened on June 22nd, 1977, by piecing together the story of that night, I was piecing together my own personal narrative in a way that would restore me.
Well, I think you commented last night that you were aware of those symptoms that you're experiencing are fairly classic post-trauma.
Absolutely,
symptoms.
I was textbook.
Yeah.
Even the fact that I woke up to that so many years later is textbook, because there's a long period of gestation.
Right. And there's this lack of connection with your own emotional experience. It's almost like your mind has put you into this stasis to protect you from all of these lousy things that have happened. And I just wonder, again, as a clinical psychologist, if you know, this impulse, it's essentially this impulse of self-preservation that encouraged you to begin this investigation, which was really, you know, fairly unprecedented. You know, have you, you know, one of the classic approaches to help manage post-traumatic stress symptoms is some variation on exposure treatment or exposure therapy. And as I was reading through your book, what finally struck me was that what you had done was meticulously, very, very gradually expose yourself to every facet of this, to the point that it no longer would likely precipitate these strong emotional reactions.
That's really well said. I did that investigation and exposing myself to the crime scene, all of the elements of the story, even my attacker, very instinctually. I only later allowed myself to read the literature on traumatology and victimology studies. And I realized that what I had done was actually kind of classic therapy.
Over a very long period of time.
Over a very long period of time.
Yes,
exactly.
But also probably much more thorough and effective, because of the level of analysis that you literally put yourself back in that, in that very place, talking to the very people who could inform you best about that event. I was curious to get a sense of whether you'd experienced some detectable symptom relief as a consequence of this experience.
Every single interview in which I did that, as you say, exposure therapy, is that what it's called?
Yeah, exposure therapy.
Exposure therapy.
It's a behavioral technique.
I literally felt, and I recorded in the book, this extraordinary feeling of transformation in my psyche.
Right.
I mean, from the most obvious example, when I went back to the crime scene, I was in absolute dread of seeing that spot again. But I walked right to it, and my instinct was to lay on the ground, because I felt like there was some part of me that I had left behind. And I wanted to get that part of me back, suck that part of me back into my body from where it was down in the soil, a few inches deep. And when I walked away from that site, I did feel like a different person. And in fact, interestingly enough, I somatized that experience in an interesting way. I had been somewhat, I was a big bone, kind of fleshy girl when I took that trip. I was always, just a little on the plump side, and when I was that age, 20. After this attack, I lost an enormous amount of weight and eventually kept that weight off to the point where I was almost, almost way too skinny. It was as though I wasn't able to inhabit my body.
Right.
There was a part of me kind of just flying out of disassociated from my body. My body was just a kind of a wraith.
Right.
Well, after I went back to Oregon and went to that crime scene and lay on the ground and restored this part of myself that I felt was in 6 inches of soil, I started to gain weight very rapidly in the course of that week.
Really?
And I gained tons of pounds, actually, to the point where I left feeling much more corpulent. Went back to LA, much heavier, much more similar to the body I had been at the age of 20 before that attack took place. Interesting somatization.
Well, you use the term dissociation or disassociation, and that is another classic symptom of post-trauma. And people they feel like they're not themselves anymore. And in fact, a very common question that people will ask is, what's happened to me? The person that I was prior to this event has been lost to me, and that's the thing that they mourn the person that they were prior to this.
Yes, they mourn the person, and that's what I had done.
And I think that's a really nice real world example of what essentially we're talking about there. We see also in the literature that trauma that comes at the hands of another person tends to be more likely to result in those post-traumatic symptoms than does a natural disaster, for example, because it bursts this perception that we have that the world is a safe place, and that most people are trustworthy and good, and that random horrible things like this don't happen intentionally; they happen only as a consequence of accident. But unfortunately, you're faced with the terrible reality that someone has intended to cause this harm to you. Was there ever any information that you gleaned that your attacker had identified you previous to this?
No, I was never able to find that out.
Okay.
For sure. Although I was able to find people who said that he had been in the park earlier that day and had likely seen us. That would explain why, when we arrived at the campground, we had this intuition that we were being watched. My roommate and I both had it separately, and actually we were fighting at the time we arrived in the park because we had disagreed over some things earlier in the day. And so the fact that we both had the same intuition was not because we influenced one another. It was a kind of that sense of being looked at, that's actually been studied as a phenomenon that we can actually feel when somebody's looking at us.
Right.
That happened, and I do believe that he'd seen us, and so he knew we were two women. Because otherwise, had he just attacked the tent, he wouldn't have known whether there were two men in the tent or not.
Right.
I was certain he had seen two women. He has a hatred for women. He was angry at his girlfriend. He took it out on us. Knowing we were in the park, he flew off the handle later that night and decided he was just there were two women in the park, and he was going to take out his rage on us.
That displacement of anger, of frustration, of rage, that's also something that we see relatively commonly in people who are poorly socialized. They don't have the skills that hopefully we encourage as a society to allow people adaptive ways of dealing with their emotional distress. We also see this in people who are bullies, and this person, through your description last night, clearly fits that category. That's the other variable that I think as a society we need to really rally around, is the notion that bullying is just unacceptable.
Yes.
But people do bully because they can, and they bully because they get away with it, and oftentimes it works. It works. It's a very effective.
That's very well said.
It's a very effective way.
Yeah.
So I think one of your other messages, at least to me, was that one of the reasons that we identify our our abuser or the person aggressing on us is we need to make sure that that person understands that those behaviors aren't acceptable, and we as a society have to hold those people accountable. That I think is a message not necessarily about women's rights, but about
everything in general, yes,
about the rights of human beings on this planet. So
yes.
I appreciated that as well. I also thought it was curious that your friend and roommate did not seem to have the same interest in this that you had. Does she have a memory of this event, or has she blocked that out? Do you know?
You know, she claims that her memory was obliterated by the blow. Mm-hmm. Retrograde amnesia mm-hmm. is what she called it. This was what she told me. Mm-hmm. I wonder whether she might have had a memory of something that she's blocked. We don't really know. We'll never know. I mean, if she's blocked it, she's probably blocked it even from herself. Mm-hmm. But part of the poignancy of my story is that she and I took absolutely diametrically opposite paths. I wanted to expose myself to the story again and, in fact, learn everything about what happened on June 22nd, 1977. She wanted to never know a single thing about it. She didn't want to know when she woke up in the hospital after surgery. Mm-hmm. She didn't want to know 5 years after, 10 years after, now 30 years after. She hasn't read the book. Mm-hmm. We are polar opposites, and that's how we remain and probably will remain our entire lives.
Well, the notion of psychogenic amnesia, that this is amnesia that's been generated by the mind as an aspect of a self-protective mechanism, suggests that either this has been repressed, unconsciously, or suppressed willfully. But the fact that she, again, apparently isn't interested in understanding more about this very important event that occurred in her life, this defining moment in her life. To some degree, supports your hypothesis, I suspect. So, what do you think about the fact that this event has been so defining for you?
I think it's a gift because I've made it a gift. Mm-hmm. It's the vehicle through which I've explored profound questions in life, everything from human psychology to the very question of human evil. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's no substitute for personal experience in a lot of ways. I'm an intellectual and someone who loves to learn from books. Right. But I am very grateful that I have this bedrock experience to draw on, and not just the experience itself, but what I've made of it. Mm-hmm. That means going back, meeting all these other people, understanding the dynamics of victimology, right. of the psychology of the perpetrator. All of this comes from this long search that I did, mm-hmm. and now I have it, for a lifetime. My next book is going to be dealing with aspects of environmental depredations, mm-hmm. and having to do with what you said about the idea of how bullying so works in this world that it's actually creating a dire situation for us in terms of the environment. Right. But I'm really honing in on this bullying behavior. Mm-hmm. So having nothing to do with women's rights particularly, but this aspect of human nature that is destroying our environment. Right.
Well, the notion that those depredations are occurring at a global and catastrophic level is something hard for us to ignore.
And such rapid right. rate that I feel a tremendous urgency to get this information out of the world. And again, it really requires coming up with the strategies to call bullies on their behavior and say, no more, we can't. Right. No, I really agree with you. And I really want to commend you for taking something that's so horrible and making such a positive thing out of it. That I think is a real testament to your strength of will and the quality of your character. Thanks, Mike. I've learned a lot from this interview.
Yeah, we're out of time today, but I want to again thank you for coming to the college and sharing your experience and your message with our community.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll say goodbye.
Okay, this is great.